Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series. My name is Ann Stout, and I'll be standing in as your host for the day. Excited to welcome our guest speakers from Farmers Mutual Hail. We have Sheila Baker and Laura Held joining us. Excited to have them visit and share information about crop insurance and its connections with relay intercropping and double cropping practices. These are questions that we've gotten frequently from farmers, as well as conservation professionals, extension folks around the state. So we're really excited to have them share their insights to help us out, both to help farmers answer those questions and to help those of us that work in the field correctly convey that information as well. So the format of today's presentation, as soon as I finish the introduction here, I will turn it over to Sheila and Laura. We're planning on a 25-minute presentation, and then any questions that you have as the presentation is going on, please type those into the chat box as we go. I'll be collecting those questions, gathering them, and then at the conclusion of the 25-minute presentation, we'll go into a question and answer session. So I'll take your questions and pass those along to Sheila and Laura. So we've got plenty of time built in for those questions at the end, but feel free to submit those to me as the presentation is going on. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sheila and Laura, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this week's webinar.
Awesome. Thanks, Ann. Appreciate it. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sheila Baker, and I am one of the underwriting managers here at Farmers Mutual Hail. And then we also have Laura Held here. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Laura Held. I am one of the regional trainers here at FMH. Looking forward to helping you all learn more about relay and double cropping.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Laura and I, as you'll find, we could talk crop insurance for hours on a day. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. But as Ian said, we welcome any questions that you guys have at the end here. So main thing we want to talk about is just a little bit about crop insurance, but then we also want to get into why farmers even want to purchase crop insurance. And then most importantly, the double and relay cropping that you guys asked me to speak about, but also how that ties into crop insurance. And we've seen a ton of changes in the last 2 years when it comes to crop insurance and allowing both double and relay cropping. So that's kind of what we'll talk about as we get started here. So just kind of wanted to hit on a few of the basics of crop insurance, because a lot of times that gets lost when we start digging into some of the details of relay and double cropping. So when we talk about multi-peril crop insurance, or MPCI, you'll often hear it referred to as, that is just our government's federally supported and regulated program. It really just is a risk protection for our farmers. And we'll talk here in a few slides about why it's so important to farmers. I think you guys could probably answer that question even more important or better than I can, but just want to talk through a little bit of that. Also, the big thing about multi-peril crop insurance is that it is all federally subsidized. So, but the big piece, and I was fortunate enough to go to Washington, D.C. and do some advocating for crop insurance. What was shocking to me from a government perspective was how many of our senators and different people didn't realize that farmers actually pay into the program. So while it is a very subsidized program by the federal government, every farmer does pay into that as well. So oftentimes they're paying that first 25% of a loss via what we kind of refer to that as a deductible on their coverage. So that's at a very high level on what multi-peril is. Just threw in one slide on crop hail and private products, because sometimes those people talk about those as one, when in reality they are very different. So when you think about a crop hail policy or a private product that might be out there by the approved insurance providers, that's something that is sold by private insurers. So for example, all of our FMH products that we have on the private product side, that's all done in-house here. We don't have any government regulation in terms of subsidies or anything like that. It's all regulated by the state departments of insurance. So that is one that could be very different from state to state. And the very unique thing about crop hail with most companies is that it can be purchased throughout the year. So, and it's not quite like multi-peril where you have to do that by a certain date every year. So just wanted to highlight that at a very high level, just to make sure people understand the difference between the two. Real quick, 2 slides on just kind of roles and responsibilities. So when we think about Federal Crop Insurance Corporation, or FCIC, when you think about the USDA branch, just kind of giving you an idea of where we fit into this realm, is under USDA, you have the RMA, which is the risk management agency. And what they do is that's who runs the program for the MPCI. So they're giving us any new products that they might have. They set all of our rates. So regardless of which company you write your multi-peril crop insurance through, that rate is going to be the same. They also set all of our program standards as well. So, sometimes we, as the next one shows here, the approved insurance providers, we as FMH are sometimes just that middle person to say, here's the policy and regulations that we receive from RMA. We're just here to kind of be that middle person to provide that coverage. So then underneath that, you have what we are as Farmers Mutual Hail. We're an approved insurance provider. There are currently 12 of those. That number is very fluid between mergers and acquisitions. But what that is basically a private sector of crop insurance companies that truly just write and reinsure those policies. So again, we're taking everything that we get from RMA and we are actually marketing those policies. We're paying the claims, we're collecting premium, and also training any agents that we are partners with as well. And then it gets down into the independent agent as well as obviously the insured or the grower. So the one thing, and again, little bit of P&C background in my world, but on the P&C side, there was a lot of what we would call captive agents, where they were kind of just only wrote with one company. You will frequently see that agents have multiple companies. And the main reason for that is relationships, and then also because of different product suites that are offered on that private product side. So those are the two main drivers, along with, personnel relationship building, that you might see agents have multiple companies that they write with. And then obviously the grower, that's who's purchasing the crop insurance. So I don't think I need to explain that one to you guys, but so that's just a little bit about kind of the high level of what our multi-peril is. But the couple things I would just point out, I've already mentioned that first one, where every single one of us, so you think of your Farmers Mutual Hail, your Rain and Hail, your RCIS, Great American, and the list goes on. We all have same rates when it comes to multi-peril policy, and we are also obligated to sell to every single insured out there. So we are not, like if you take somebody that maybe has a river bottom that is floods every year and has a loss paid every year, that loss ratio doesn't matter to us in terms of what we can sell to that grower. So again, when you think about a government program, we want to make sure that it's available for everybody and that everybody has a way to use it. The other thing, like I mentioned too, is the cost. It's the same across all those 12 AIPs that I mentioned. So there's no difference. So as you can about imagine, relationships are the most important part of how we as an AIP do gain new business. When it comes to what multi-peril covers, so the perils that it covers, it's going to be any what I would call a naturally occurring event. So when you think about some of the unfortunate weather events that we have had over the the last few years, but even the last few weeks, those are things that would be covered. So what I always kind of try to say is it's nothing that's man-made, right? So you look at lightning, you look at drought, you look at hail, those things are all going to be in insects or plant disease. That's all going to be covered under the multi-peril policy. The few things that it does not cover, so the one thing that I feel like RMA and all of us as AIPs do a good job of is making sure that we are following good farming practices out there in the field. So that is one thing that is not covered. So if somebody is not caring for that crop as they should be, then that is not going to be a covered peril. So they might have had a low production just because they didn't care for that crop. That is not going to be covered under the multi-peril policy. Also, if anybody, themselves, unfortunately, we do see some theft and malicious mischief that happens, people driving through a field, things like that. That also would not be covered under the multi-peril policy. So again, more naturally occurring events is what you're going to see when it comes to the multi-peril side. Just a few stats when it comes to multi-peril. Over 90% of all insurable farmland is protected in the United States. So when you think about that, that's a pretty big number. And then kind of as I go to the right here, 490 million acres are actually insured. And again, this is across all 12 AIPs. So this is obviously not just at Farmers Mutual Hail. This is across everywhere. But in 2023 alone, there was $194 billion worth of crops and livestock that were insured last year. So pretty impactful numbers when it comes to thinking about the livelihoods of the farmers and being able to help support them when it comes to some of these natural disasters. There's also the good thing about crop insurance is there's 136 different crops that are insurable. So us being right here in the good old state of Iowa, we don't sometimes see all those, but we're coast to coast. And so we do see a very different variety of crops that are out there. And just a kind of a fun slide that's out there that kind of shows how much this does contribute back to Iowa. So in 2023, Iowa crops contributed $44 billion to the economy. Obviously, corn, soybeans, and hybrid seed corn were our top 3 crops that were actually insured. And then, I think kind of the dark green there is where farmers actually paid $675.2 million into for their insurance. And then we as insurers paid out $1.1 billion in last year in terms of losses that were out there. So again, there to protect the farmers, help them sleep at night. That's kind of the main thing that we're looking at there. So when we think of real high level, again, I've been in crop insurance like we talked about for 16 years. I could spend 16 hours probably on this slide as it sits, but just to kind of give you a little bit of conceptually about how crop insurance works is that when I talked at the beginning about private products and crop hail, being able to buy those at different times of the year, as you guys are probably all aware, March 15th is a pretty big sales closing date around the state of Iowa. When it comes to your corn and soybeans, for sure, you will have a March 15th sales closing date. And that is the date that you have to have, and I say you as a farmer, the farmer has to have their policy signed up for the year, even though you don't have any crops probably in the ground yet for those particular crops. So that's all has to happen up front. So March is a pretty busy time for our agents, farmers, and here in the office as well. And that coverage just kind of sits there. There is some replant coverage. There is some prevent plant that might come into play at that point, kind of in that what I call early season of the crop. And then obviously when you're out there planting, you're probably working with an agent to go in and give them the acres of where you actually planted those particular crops. And that at that point, that's when policy will actually have liability. So that's when they have a pretty good indication of how much their production needs to be in order for either them to outgrow or to have a loss. So that's kind of the planting phase of it. And then ultimately, none of the production claims would be actually finalized until we get to harvest time. So that's a super high level of what crop insurance is, but it's very cyclical. The big thing to remember, especially if you're newer to crop insurance, is that you really only have one time throughout the year to sign up for that coverage. So you might have crops out there that look pretty good in the middle of, let's say we're, a little bit farther along and crops look pretty good. Maybe you want to throw some crop hail coverage. That's the difference. Multi-peril you can't buy in the middle of the year, but that crop hail or private product side, sometimes you can. So very high level on what crop insurance is. Just wanted to point out how important some of these dates are, and I won't go through each of these, but just have a slide here for what 2024 soybean dates are, and I just picked one county, Winnebago County. But as you can see, and the next slide is really just talks about corn with these same things. So that sales closing date, like I mentioned, pretty important date. The other thing, when you look at earliest planting date, so we get that question a lot from farmers, like, well, what does it mean if I actually plant on 4/12? Or what if I actually plant on 4/10? Really, you will still have coverage for that year, but the thing that you miss out on is replant coverage. So that date is what RMA, who's our risk management agency, has determined with their ag experts that is the earliest day we could or should plant. But I will say we're continually seeing that date being earlier and earlier, especially across the country. So, but as it sits right now, 2024 soybeans 4/15 was the earliest plant date. Then you kind of go on down to final planting date is June 15th. You still have the ability to plant after. You can see that next one shows the end of the late planting period, gets into the July timeframe. The big difference there is that you do lose a little bit of the guarantee as you get later into the year of planting. All acres have to be reported by that 7/15 date on an acreage report with the agent. And then we actually don't bill, and this is the same for all AIPs, but we don't actually bill for crop insurance until August. So even though you've had coverage on that crop all year long, hopefully not a replant or prevent plant payment, but we've been on that coverage all year, then you don't pay that bill until that August, September timeframe. And then insurance does end on December 10th. So that's kind of just a high level. That's what corn looks like as well. Dates are a little bit different, obviously. Biggest ones being your final planting date of 5/31, and then your end of late planting period for corn at the 6/25. Otherwise, everything else is pretty much the same. So just a quick couple slides here on why do people want crop insurance? So when we think about crop insurance, what keeps farmers up at night? Most of the time when we ask that question, it's their risk protection. They want to be able to sleep at night. They want to protect that family farm. And that's exactly what we're doing. So that's our mission here at FMH, is to protect the livelihood of farmers. And so that's what crop insurance, we feel, does. If we look at just a super quick high level example, what a farmer might look at. So when a farmer is potentially looking at what they want to cover from a crop insurance perspective, a lot of time that starts with covering the input costs. So let's just pretend for this example that they have an approved yield of 58 bushel an acre for their soybeans. So what an approved yield is basically that's what they're guaranteed for that year that they will prove. And that number is based on usually a whole, a 10-year history of what they've produced in the past. This year, the projected price was at $11.55. We also heard from a farmer on, again, just an example, not real numbers on some of these, but $500 an acre is what it cost them to get an acre of soybeans into the ground. So if that farmer chose 65% coverage level, there's the math. So you look at the 58 bushel an acre times 67%. So what that means is 65% of 58 is the 37.7. And if you take that times the price, that $11.55, what we would be covering at that point is $435 an acre in coverage. So that's what the farmer and the agent are going to sit down and talk about, is $435 an acre in coverage, enough for me to feel good about going to sleep at night, knowing that I can protect my legacy of the farm, my family, all those things. Or do I need to maybe bump it up to that 75%, which will cover the full $502 that it might have cost me to put that crop into the ground? So again, very simple example, but just wanted to kind of explain how crop insurance works at a very high level. So then for the last 10 to 12 minutes here, just going to talk through kind of what you guys wanted me to as well, but the double cropping and relay cropping. So just wanted to give a high level on some of the history of some of the changes that came. So there was a bulletin that was issued back in July of 2020. So the Biden administration and Ag Secretary Vilsack announced the double cropping initiative for 2023 crops. And their big thing there, and you can read the entire speech out there, obviously, if you wanted to, but the bottom line was that they just want to make it easier for farmers to be able to grow food in America, increase our food supply, and lower costs for American families. So at a very high level, that's what the goal was. And then now we're seeing some of the impacts of that. And that's what we'll talk through here. So I know it is really bad to read from a slide. And I went over this with Laura and I said, I know this is bad, but I really think when it comes to these two definitions, that's really the only way to make sure we fully understand both the definitions of relay cropping and double cropping. So I'm going to read, I apologize now, but when we think double cropping, that's really defined as producing two or more crops for harvest on the same acreage in the same crop year. And that crop year is always designated by the calendar year in which the insured crop is normally harvested. So for example, if you had wheat that you planted in the fall of 2023 and soybeans were planted in the spring of 24, that's going to be considered planted for the harvest in the same crop year. So that would be a double cropping situation. Okay. And I'm going to real quick just jump over to the relay cropping and go through that definition so you see those two differences. Relay cropping is where you're going to have a second planted crop, or that relay crop that's planted into an established crop, not a cover crop. So you got to kind of separate those, where the crops are planted in a manner that allows separate agronomic maintenance and harvest of the crop unless otherwise defined by the crop provisions. But the big thing here is this last piece, that damage to either crop during planting, harvest, or general maintenance will be considered an uninsurable cause of loss. So again, when you think about double cropping, it's two separate crops. When you have relay, I would call it a little bit intermingled, right? So, but the big thing with the relay cropping is that there can't be any damage done to either crop when you are planting that relay crop into the original crop. So again, I kind of talked about this already when it came to trying to make it easier for producers. So if you just take a step back into what the crop policy looks like without double cropping or relay cropping, like prior to that, it basically says you can only insure and harvest one crop off a piece of ground. So what did RMA try to do? They tried to come in and say, well, there's quite a few areas where we can get 2 crops off of a singular piece of ground in that calendar year. So why can't we make that insurable? So that's what they kind of did. We talk about it in the terms of written agreements, and they offered a lot of written agreements in a new area, and I'll get into what those are. But that was the main thing that the first thing RMA did was they came out and said, because there are spots that, like in Kansas, for example, there's what they call following another crop practice that's already insurable. So there's parts of the country that already had this as part of their normal rotation just because the weather was the main reason that allowed for it. But as you guys, people like yourself are starting to realize the importance of this and the impact that it can have, RMA is recognizing that as well and allowing that to be an insurable practice that's used. So here's where double cropping is available for soybeans. So when we think about double cropping, they kind of came out and said, we have double cropping available for soybeans to be that double crop, and then also for grain sorghum. So when we talk about soybeans, if you look at just the state of Iowa, those top 3 rows have to be done with a written agreement, but you also have to have 3 years of history of doing that double cropping to be able to qualify for that written agreement. And then basically the bottom 2/3 of the state, you still have to have a written agreement. However, no history is required. So it could be the first year that you're attempting double cropping that you could try to qualify for a written agreement. So for grain sorghum, though, unfortunately, that is the one that currently there's no double cropping that's allowed in Iowa when you have grain sorghum behind, that wheat or whatever it might be your first crop. So that's currently how it is. I'm going to show in a couple slides where that might be hopefully changing eventually, but I'll kind of walk through that here in just a second. Also wanted to show where relay cropping is available. So up in that northwest corner of Iowa, when it comes to the written agreement that has to be requested for that, again, you have to have 3 years of records to be able to apply for this written agreement. All the other counties in Iowa, though, no records are required. So again, first year doing a relay crop situation, you could attempt to get a written agreement for that. So I've talked a lot about written agreements. Now, what the heck is it, right? So when we think of what a written agreement is, basically this is a way to possibly insure something that RMA hasn't made available yet. So the double cropping, the relay cropping in Iowa. The other one I use a lot for an example is grapes in Iowa. For example, that is not currently that is not a crop that's allowed to be grown in Iowa for crop insurance. However, we can submit a written agreement to RMA and say, hey, this grower was able to show this much history of doing this. We think they should be insurable. So that's what a written agreement is. If it's approved by RMA, then it allows insurance to be bound. The one thing to remember on written agreements, though, is there is a very strict deadline with RMA that it has to be in by a certain date. So again, that's where you're going to want to, and I'm not going to give any dates at the time just because it does vary by crop. It does vary by your plan of insurance as well as the county that you're in, so location that you might be in. But the reason I would encourage you, if you're interested at all in this, to talk with your agent is because RMA uses all the written agreements they get every year for all those host of reasons. It could be the double cropping, could be relay cropping, could be that grapes insurable in Iowa. But they look at everything they get to potentially then make that just insurable without the written agreement. So, as we, this double cropping and relay cropping, there was actually a lot of changes down in Kansas back in that 23 year. And they already turned a lot of that in 24 to actually being insurable without a written agreement. So that's why I always encourage people, if they're interested in it, they should do it because, again, that's what RMA is using to actually potentially make things insurable on their own. just a couple slides here, and we're kind of nearing the end, but want to just catch these couple real quick. Just want to show some of the growth that we're seeing on double cropping written agreements. So in 2023, RMA actually had 1,150 blanket written agreements with acreage attached to them. And then traditional was 1,300. And the only difference between a blanket and traditional is basically a blanket allowed you to just have a certain yield, and kind of everything was the same across whoever got the blanket, where a traditional may have been more specific to your farming operation. So it's a very technical difference. Overall, you're looking at 2,400, 2,500 written agreements that were done on double cropping, all because of this double cropping initiative. When we look at relay cropping, those numbers maybe aren't quite as exciting as what you're seeing, but that's where I would encourage, especially you guys that know the benefits of this, that as we continue to see more of these, I mean, seeing 80, that's a 15% increase over what they'd seen in years prior. So again, that's only 1 year of growth in terms of that announcement coming out to what we saw. 63 of those were accepted. So what that to me says is those others that weren't, that 17 that wasn't, that possibly could be that RMA said, well, maybe you're still just not in an area that we feel that's appropriate. And there were 3,000 acres that were actually insured as of October of 23. So that's the kind of the numbers around it. Again, seems like a little bit lower number on the relay cropping, but again, I think that's just because we haven't seen enough people grab onto why this could work and the ways it could work. So the benefits to the farmers for having this is basically it does allow for a potential indemnity on both crops if rules and regulations are met, but it is also two premiums too. But again, if we think about what the goals of the administration was when they set this out, is to get more crop out there, more food on the table, that type of thing. This is a way that they're doing it. Again, it allows you to harvest those two different crops. And then again, just knowing that this practice seems to be growing across, a lot of the U.S., I think it's just a really good way for RMA to put their foot in the door here. So that was, and again, I know that I talk really fast, so but that's a very quick 25-minute overview of how relay cropping and just the growth that we've seen in terms of some of the changes that RMA made to the policy. So I would just encourage you, no different than this PowerPoint always, is that the policy provisions would obviously be the most important thing here, but talk to your agent. Laura and I are also happy to answer any questions that you have, but your agent also would have a good understanding of how these two work into crop insurance. So, and with that, I'll turn it back to you for now.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. And if you could advance on to the next couple
You bet.
slides, I've got a couple housekeeping slides to cover. And in the meantime, folks, feel free to submit any questions in the chat. And we've got several in here already, but any others that you're thinking of, now is a great time to get those in. So if you are watching today's webinar and would like to earn a Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Unit or a CEU, please send your information by 5 o'clock today to Alena Whitaker. Her email is up on the screen there, alenaw@iastate.edu. And so the information that she'll need would be your name, the name you used to watch the webinar, if that's different, and then your CCA number. And then she'll cross-reference that with the attendance records and submit all the paperwork to get you your CCA CEU. So by 5 o'clock today, please send that to Alena. All right, and we'd also like to request your help. If you're watching the webinar today, we would like to request your help and participation in this voluntary demographic survey. If you've watched previous Iowa Learning Farms webinars this year, calendar year 24, and have already completed the survey, thank you, much appreciated. If you have not yet, we'd encourage you to fill that out. You can either scan the QR code if you're feeling savvy with that, or we've got the URL right up on the screen there at iowalearningfarms.org/survey. And so it's a voluntary demographic survey collection to gather race, ethnicity, gender information regarding folks who participate in any USDA funded programs, which we are. So appreciate your willingness to participate and help out in sharing data there. Okay, and next week we'll be back, same time, same place, next Wednesday, July 3rd. Very timely topic here. So exploring traits and tactics with summer annual forage. And so our presenter will be Shelby Gruss, assistant professor in forage extension here at Iowa State University with ISU Extension and Outreach. So tune in next Wednesday, Shelby Gruss, exploring traits and tactics with summer annual forage. And then finally, if you do all have one more slide, you can advance forward for
sorry.
me.
Yep.
Perfect, you're good. So we'll leave this up here so folks can see it, but you are welcome to take a look at today's webinar. We'll get that posted and up online, so you can find today's webinar later today, and then all of our other previous webinars on our website, so iowalearningfarms.org/webinars, and also on YouTube. So we've got a separate playlist. We've got a separate channel set up at iLearningFarms-webinars, and there's playlists set up with the webinars presented, sorted out by year as well as by topic. So if you're looking for a particular theme, a particular topic, that is an easy way to find it. So same content in both places, but you've got whichever is your preferred platform. Go ahead and take a look there. Okay, so let's dive in with our questions here. Okay, so I'll start out with, are fruit and nut orchards covered in terms of insurance?
They could be, I think is the way I would probably have to answer that at the moment. We would need a little bit more information on location of those, and also would want to get into some questions about what did they have for history. So if it's here in Iowa, 99% of the time, it might need to be under a written agreement. Now, I will say RMA also has some programs like whole farm revenue protection, which is a newer, well, I say newer, it's I think 5, 6, 7 years now it's been out. But what that looks at is truly just a farm operation as a whole. And again, if we're talking about the purpose of that, it was for those type of growers where maybe there's just not a natural market for fruit and nut orchards right here in Iowa, but that whole farm does allow for some of that. Now there are qualifications, different things like that, but whole farm would be one I would look at. And then also, like I said, we would need a little more information on the location and the farmer's history, but the long and short would say it could be. I think is how I would have to answer that at this point.
Sounds good. And I think this question is related as well, but are local food producers covered?
Yeah, so that is a big one. If you look at any whole farm revenue protection and or micro farm is another one. So micro farm was just brought out last 2 years, I think.
2 years ago.
And what that is basically for those small, what I call a smaller grower that is up to $350,000 of revenue or under. And so that might be a spot, or they could do the whole farm as well. So what the whole farm policy really was about was kind of looking at those diverse farmers that maybe have, they do their farming, but then they go to a farmer's market or have roadside stands, that type of thing, which again is not just I don't want to say it's not a typical farmer in Iowa, but we just don't have a crop insurance market for that. That's what whole farm looks at. So those are the two policies. And that's why I brought Laura too for any add-on to any questions. So if there's anything else you want to add there.
I think that part of the goal of microfarm is really to simplify the complexity of the whole farm revenue protection product, and also try to give a product to those small local producers. Yep. Really is the intent of that product.
Yep.
Sounds good. So you all mentioned several times the written agreement, which is required with the double cropping, with the relay cropping, with some of these newer practices. Could you give us a little bit more information? So who writes it? Who provides it? Yeah. Is there a template for that? Kind of walk us through the process.
Yeah. Yep. So basically how that works is there is a form that the insured would need to fill out, and along with the agent. And basically what it's going to ask is kind of some of those planting patterns, or what you've done to kind of prove that there has been a history of, double cropping. Let's just use double cropping, for example. And to provide the location of where that's going to be. So the other thing we have to get is we have to get down to the CLUs or the common land units of where you're planning to have that double cropped soybean or whatever it might be. And then also we are going to be looking at, a lot of times they will ask for an ag expert's recommendation that says this is okay to, for this climate, this area, all those things. And that can be a whole host of different people when it comes to an ag expert. So your local extension office, your agronomist in the area, all those
Crop
types.
advisors.
Crop advisor.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. That is one thing that RMA does, give a pretty lengthy list for who qualifies under that. So those are three of the things. So once the farmer and the farmer and the agent get all that information, they submit it to us as the approved insurance provider. So then actually that's kind of what my team does on the underwriting side, is we look through all those documents and make sure we have everything. And we also make sure that we feel like it should be insurable too. And so then at that point, we send it to RMA, and then RMA ultimately is the one that will either deny that or approve it. And I can't actually say exactly what they look at because they get thousands of these a year, but they're reviewing it basically for just, does it make sense from a taxpayer's money to be able to, give that policy out? Does it make sense for just the integrity of the program? Is kind of two of the main things that they're looking at to make sure we're using taxpayers' money the correct way. So that's kind of what I'd say is a high level of how a written agreement comes to be.
Yeah, and I would just say most agents know that they have questions when they're working with a farmer on that document that needs filled out. They're going to reach out to their underwriter with whatever insurance company they're with for guidance through that process if they're not familiar with it.
Yep, absolutely.
Excellent. Sounds good. Okay, next question. If you insure any of your acres through MPCI, do you have to insure all of your crop acres in an MPCI policy?
Yeah, so I can take it and then Laura can correct me, but no. So you have to insure all of that particular crop in that county. So when I say that, if you have corn and soybeans in Polk and Dallas County, for example, but you only sign up to insure corn in both of those counties, but you do have to give us all acres of the corn in both of those two counties. So whatever election you make on that March 15th date, and again, that's for most corn and soybeans, but there are some different sales closing dates. So I want to make sure we call that out too. You have to insure all the acres of whatever crops you elect to be insured and in whatever county. But crop insurance very much is by crop, by county.
I'm just going to add in, that's the MPCI products, right?
Yes.
If an insured wanted to take out crop hail, which is different, or those private products, it does allow some picking and choosing of what they insure. So add a little clarification there.
Yeah. Yep.
Sounds good. What are some examples? You've mentioned a couple of private products a couple of times. What are some examples of private products that could be added on to a policy?
Yeah, so I'll just take a couple of maybe the basics. So when you think of a crop hail policy, as we all would, we think crop hail, right? Like we think the hail that falls and did last night in a lot of areas. But really that policy also has a lot of other perils that are included with that. So you have, and again, I would encourage you, again, these are very different by the company that writes them. So make sure that you're talking with an agent so I can speak to what Farmers Mutual Hail policy covers, but I can't speak to the others, obviously. So if you're just looking at a basic crop hail policy with us, you get coverage from, and this won't be an all-inclusive list, but transit. So when you harvest that crop and take it to a bin or you take it to a co-op, whatever it might be, that transit coverage. So if something happens to a vehicle, that would be covered. Another thing would be storage. So once you do, if it's in a bin or whatever, there is storage in that bin for a period of time. The other thing that our crop hail policy does cover is a fire department surcharge. So if a fire department has to come out, whether it's a combine fire in the field or the field catches on fire, sometimes those volunteer will have a $250 or $500 service charge. That's usually covered on the crop hail policy. And then the other one that we hope we never ever have to use, but it is in there, is accidental death. If unfortunately, get the goosebumps even saying it, but if unfortunately a farmer passes away due to operations on the farm, then that there is coverage that we waive that premium, and there's not a policy, they don't have to pay for that policy. So those would be a few of them.
Crop fire.
Yep. Crop fire would be another one. So, and again, that's actually
Another
a really
private
good
product.
example. Yep.
Yeah.
Another private product that we have. And that's a good one, especially in those drought years. We do get a lot of requests in for that. The other thing, and that's kind of a good delineation between what a crop hail policy would cover and multi-peril, is when it comes to, somebody's driving down the road, throws out a cigarette butt, field catches on fire. On the multi-peril side, unfortunately, that's not usually a covered peril because it's man-made. But on the crop hail side, it could be. So that's kind of, one of those. The other one, I'm sure if you're into the crop insurance world at all, you've heard a lot about the supplemental coverage option and extended coverage option, or SCO, ECO, your ARC PLC elections at the FSA office. We as FMH have some products that kind of tie on to that. So we have kind of a supplemental coverage option plus. We have, some of those things, and that's why it does vary quite a bit between the different approved insurance providers. But those would be a few anyway, of, when you get out into the West Coast, and actually for some of your fruit and nut, we do have like citrus freeze and some business interruption. So it kind of really depends on the area and what they have as a grower. But that's why we do encourage them to talk with their agent if they have kind of those unique things, and see if there is, because oftentimes there is more than just a production loss or a price decrease coverage.
Excellent. Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. And
Yeah.
you were actually talking through a couple examples related to fire. And we've got a question. This is kind of a specific example, but I think this looks like a relay intercropping question. But would there be coverage to either or both crops if, for example, like a man-made fire through the mature small grain crop also terminated the emerging large grain crop? So let's say, so fire, like if that affected the emerging soybean, for instance.
Sure. So at a very high level, I can say that there is potential for both of those two crops to have an indemnity paid. We would have to have an adjuster go out on site and, work through all those things from, and again, I'm not saying that this is happening in this situation or anything, but, good farming practices, all those things. And I'm also going to be 100% honest that I am an underwriter and not a claims analyst. And actually on the crop insurance side, that's actually a big, like, we in underwriting can't cross over into those lines just from a government, again, trying to protect that the taxpayers' money. So there is a potential for it to have a loss paid on both. But we would, I know this is a super terrible response, but we would need some more information about the two crops and the time of year and that information. But there's a potential.
And there's more rules around the federal crop insurance product, the NPCI product versus that crop hail product that may cover differently. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yep.
Sounds good. Okay. And then why is grain sorghum not allowed to be insured in Iowa for double cropping?
It is insurable in a select few counties, but not double cropping. That's the key there.
Yeah. So I think from a double cropping, and that's where I am a big proponent of advocating for things like this, and I'm sure you guys are too, right? So that is where and again, I don't want to give you work to do, but that's where I think it's super important for us to be talking as constituents, talking with our people that are in our elected positions to say, this actually works very well in Iowa. Why can we not get it as a double cropping? And again, with it being a government program, that usually does carry some weight when our elected officials hear from us as constituents, whether it's us as an approved insurance provider or truly boots on the ground farmers in the field or anybody in the industry. So I don't have a good answer for that. I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to grow. If I look at the relay cropping and double cropping maps as they were in 2023 to 2024, you'll see a big difference in growth. I wouldn't be surprised if 2025 we see even more. So I don't think I would definitely say that just because it's not on there today doesn't mean it won't be tomorrow.
And I think with anything, you didn't say the lobby word,
Yeah.
but I mean,
Yes.
truly, when you do that, it really helps make changes to the policy side. So then that's implemented by crop insurance companies through the RMA. The other point that I was thinking about is as Sheila had mentioned earlier during written agreements for relay cropping, how there's such a small number of insured relay crop policies. It has to do with them just not knowing what's being done out in the countryside. And the only way they'll know and the only way changes can happen is communicating, lobbying, working with RMA, working with your agents, and really truly letting RMA know exactly what's happening out in the countryside. That's when changes will happen. I mean, plant dates, I think that's a great example. You know, people don't always want to put when they actually plant a crop because they're worried about their coverage. But dates changed in Iowa here in the last year on the earliest plant date based on what people were actually putting on their policy acreage reports. So I think it's important for the integrity of the program that if you want changes, show the changes that are actually happening and communicate them.
Sounds great. Excellent. Well, that covers the questions that we've got here today. So Sheila, Laura, thank you both for providing us some excellent information, overview of the crop insurance program in general, but then specifically how that can apply to both double cropping and relay intercropping, some of these emerging practices that we're expecting to see more and more of in the years ahead. So really appreciative of your time. And to all of our viewers, next week we'll be back July 3rd, noon central, with Shelby Gruss covering summer annual forages. So hope you'll be able to join us then. So thank you everyone for your time and have a great rest of your day.